Part 3. What is to be done? Chapter 7. The Crisis of Determinate Negation. Back in the 1950s and 1960s, when the Frankfurt School adopted an increasingly critical attitude towards the classical Marxist notion of the historical necessity of revolution, this critique also culminated in their abandonment of the Hegelian notion of determinate negation, the obverse of which is the rise of the notion of the wholly other, das ganz andere, as the prospect of the utopian overcoming of the global techno-capitalist order. The idea is that with the dialectic of enlightenment, which tends towards the zero point of the totally administered society, one can no longer conceptualize breaking out of the deadly spiral of this dialectic by means of the classical Marxist notion according to which the new will emerge from the very contradictions of the present society, through its immanent self-overcoming. The impetus for such an overcoming can only come from an unmediated outside. This abandonment of determinate negation is, of course, the obverse of accepting capitalism's triumph. As we have already noted, the most reliable sign of capitalism's ideological triumph was the virtual disappearance of the very term over the last 2 or 3 decades. The contemporary left has reacted in a wide spectrum of modes, which partially overlap, to the full hegemony of global capitalism and its political supplement, liberal democracy. 1. Full acceptance of this framework, continuing to fight for emancipation within its rules. Third way, social democracy. 2. Acceptance of this framework as something that is here to stay, but which one should nonetheless resist, withdrawing from its scope and operating from its interstices. Simon Critchley is an exemplar of this position. 3. Acceptance of the futility of all struggle, since the framework is today all-encompassing, coinciding with its opposite, the logic of concentration camps, the permanent state of emergency. So nothing can really be done. One can only wait for an outburst of divine violence. A revolutionary version of Heidegger's "Only God can still save us," a perspective today embodied by Giorgio Agamben, and, in a way, before him, by the late Adorno. 4. Acceptance of the temporary futility of struggle. In today's triumph of global capitalism, true resistance is not possible, at least not in the metropolis of capitalism, so all we can do till the renewal of the revolutionary spirit in the global working class is to defend what there still is of the welfare state, bombarding those in power with demands we know they cannot fulfill, and otherwise withdraw into cultural studies, where one can silently pursue critical work. 5. Emphasis on the fact that the problem is a more fundamental one, that global capitalism is ultimately an ontic effect of the underlying ontological principle of technology, or instrumental reason. Heidegger, but in a way, again, also Adorno. 6. Belief that one can undermine global capitalism and state power, however, not by way of directly attacking them, but by refocusing the field of struggle on everyday practices, where one can build a new world. In this way, the foundations of the power of capital and the state will be gradually undermined, and at some point the state will collapse like a cat hovering over the precipice in the cartoons. One thinks here of the Zapatista movement. 7. A postmodern shift of the accent from anti-capitalist struggle to the multiple forms of the politico-ideological struggle for hegemony, conceptualized as a contingent process of discursive rearticulation. Ernesto Laclau. 8. A wager that one can repeat at the postmodern level the classical Marxist gesture and enact the determinate negation of capitalism. With today's rise of cognitive work, the contradiction between social production and capitalist relations has reached an unprecedented height, rendering absolute democracy possible for the first time. Hardt and Negri. One is tempted to categorize these versions as so many modes of the negations of politics proper, which follow the different modes of avoiding a traumatic real in psychoanalysis. Acceptance through denial. Verneinung, a version of whoever that woman in my dream is, it is not my mother. Whatever the new antagonisms are, they are not class struggle. psychotic foreclosure. Verwerfung. The foreclosed class struggle returns in the real, in the paranoid guise of an invisible and all-powerful enemy, like the Jewish plot. Neurotic repression. Verdrängung. The repressed class struggle returns in the guise of a multiplicity of new antagonisms. And fetishistic disavowal. Verleumdung. The elevation into the principal cause of some fetishistic ersatz of the class struggle as the last thing which we see prior to confronting the class antagonism. We are not dealing here with a series of avoidances of some true radical leftist position. The trauma these avoidances try to blur is rather the lack of such a position. The lesson of the last decades, if there is one, is the indestructibility of capitalism. When already Marx compared it to a vampire, we should bear in mind the living dead aspect of vampires. They always rise up again and again after being stabbed to death. Even the radical Maoist attempt in the Cultural Revolution to wipe out the traces of capitalism ended up with its triumphant return. The humorous superego. A fear is haunting whatever remains of the contemporary left. The fear of directly confronting state power. Those who still insist on fighting state power, let alone directly taking it over, are immediately accused of being stuck in the old paradigm. The task today is to resist state power by withdrawing from its scope, subtracting oneself from it, creating new spaces outside its control. This dogma of the contemporary academic left is best encapsulated by the title of Negri's interview book, Goodbye, Mr. Socialism. The idea is that the time of the old left, in its two versions, reformist and revolutionary, which both aimed at taking over state power and protecting the working class's corporate rights, is over. Today, the predominant form of exploitation is the exploitation of knowledge, and so on and so forth. There is a new postmodern social development going on which the old left refuses to take into account, and in order to renovate itself, the left has to read Deleuze and Negri and start to practice nomadic resistance, follow the theory of hegemony, and so on. But what if this very mode of defining the problem is part of the problem? Since the institutionalized left, the third way social democrats, the trade unions, and others, so persistently refuses to learn this lesson, the problem must, also, reside with its postmodern critics. Within this postmodern field, Simon Critchley's Infinitely Demanding is an almost perfect embodiment of the position to which my work is absolutely opposed, and that at two distinct but interconnected levels. That of the account of subjectivity as arising out of ethical commitment to a good, and that of the proposed politics of resistance. When he includes himself among the critical, secular, well-dressed metrosexual post-Kantians, the irony of this self-characterization occludes its seriousness. No wonder Critchley included in the list of those who resist the clutches of state power Princess Diana herself. Critchley's starting point is the motivational deficit of our liberal democratic institutions. This deficit sustains two main political attitudes, those of passive and active nihilism. On the one hand, cynical indifference, escape into consumerist hedonism, and so on. And on the other, violent fundamentalism, which aims at destroying the corrupt liberal universe. Critchley's problem is how to break out of this deadlock, how to resuscitate emancipatory political passion. This problem is a real one, in our allegedly post-ideological era. After the self-proclaimed end of great emancipatory projects, the gap between meaning and truth seems insurmountable. Who still dares to claim access to a cognitive mapping of our constellation that would simultaneously open up space for a meaningful, radical social transformation? Consequently, today, the very idea of a politics of truth is dismissed as totalitarian. Above and beyond efficient social administration, the main acceptable political goals are negative: to prevent pain and suffering, to establish the minimal conditions for the toleration of different ways of life, to each their own truth. And the task of politics is seen as the art of pragmatic compromise, of the coordination of interests, of guaranteeing the peaceful coexistence of ways of life. as if economic uniformity and cultural diversity were the two sides of the same process. However, this liberal democratic prospect remains haunted by the spectre of fundamentalism. Recall the public reaction to the Pope's death. Who would like to live in a state which prohibits abortion and divorce? And yet, the same people who reject the Pope's views admire him for his firm, principled, ethical stance and his message of hope, thereby displaying the need for a firm standard of truth beyond pragmatic relativism. How, then, to break out of this deadlock? Critchley proceeds in two steps. First, in a combination of Levinas, Badiou, and Lacan, he deploys the notion of the subject as constituted by its recognition in an unconditional ethical call engendered by the experience of injustice and wrongs. Then he proposes a notion of politics as resistance to state power on behalf of this ethical call. The subject emerges as a reaction to the traumatic encounter of the helpless suffering other, neighbor, which is why it is constitutively dissented, not autonomous, but split by the ethical call, a subject defined by the experience of an internalized demand that it can never meet, a demand that exceeds it. The paradox constitutive of the subject is thus the demand that the subject cannot meet, so that the subject is constitutively divided, its autonomy always usurped by the heteronomous experience of the other's demand. Only an omnipotent and infinite God would have been able to meet such a demand. So, knowing that there is no God, we have to subject ourselves to the demand to be God-like, knowing that we are sure to fail because of our finite condition. Critchley refers here to Levinas's claim that my relation to the other is not some benign benevolence, compassionate care, or respect for the other's autonomy, but is the obsessive experience of a responsibility that persecutes me with its sheer weight. I am the other's hostage. How, then, can the subject attenuate the crushing weight of the superego? How can I respond in infinite responsibility to the other without extinguishing myself as a subject? Critchley turns here to Lacan, to the way Lacan elaborated Freud's notion of sublimation. Aesthetic sublimation enables the subject to achieve a minimum of happiness. The beautiful interposes itself between the subject and the good. It places the subject in relation to the source of the ethical demand, but which protects the subject from the direct glare of the thing. Critchley adds humor to the list of sublimations as the benevolent aspect of the superego. In contrast to the evil, punishing superego, the severe judge, which crushes us with the weight of infinite guilt on account of our failure to live up to its call, in humor, in which we also observe our finitude and ridiculous failure from the standpoint of the superego, our finitude appears as funny, ridiculous in its failures. Instead of installing anguish and despair, this superego enables us to laugh at our limitations, failures, and false pretensions. What Critchley strangely leaves out of consideration is the brutal sadistic aspect of humor itself. Humor can be extremely cruel and denigrating. Let us take an extreme example. The infamous Arbeit macht frei over the gates of Auschwitz is no argument against the dignity of work. Work truly makes us free, as Hegel put it in the famous passage of his Phenomenology of Spirit on master and servant. What the Nazis did with the motto at the gates of Auschwitz is simply an act of cruel mockery, analogous to raping someone while wearing a t-shirt saying, "Sex brings pleasure." Critchley's claim that some versions of psychoanalysis, particularly Lacan's, have a problem with the superego is thus odd. Lacan was fully aware not only of the link between humor and the superego, but also of the brutal sadistic aspect of humor. The Marx brothers' Duck Soup, their masterpiece, is regarded as a work that makes fun of ridiculous totalitarian state rituals, denouncing their empty posturing, and so on. Laughter is the mightiest weapon. No wonder that totalitarian regimes found it so threatening. This commonplace should be turned upside down. The powerful effect of Duck Soup does not reside in its mockery of the totalitarian state's machinery and paraphernalia, but in openly displaying the madness, the fun, the cruel irony, which are already present in the totalitarian state. The Marx brothers' carnival is the carnival of totalitarianism itself. What is the superego? Recall the strange fact, regularly evoked by Primo Levi and other Holocaust survivors, regarding how their intimate reaction to their survival was marked by a deep split. Consciously, They were fully aware that their survival was just a meaningless accident, that they were not in any way responsible for it, that the only guilty perpetrators were their Nazi torturers. At the same time, they were, more than mildly, haunted by the irrational feeling of guilt, as if they had survived at the expense of others who had died, and were thus somehow responsible for their deaths. As is well known, this unbearable feeling of guilt drove many of the survivors to suicide. This feeling of guilt displays the agency of the superego at its purest, the obscene agency which manipulates us into a spiraling movement of self-destruction. What this means is that the function of the superego is precisely to obfuscate the cause of the terror constitutive of our being human, the inhuman core of being human, the dimension of what the German idealists called negativity and what Freud called the death drive. Far from being the traumatic hard core of the real from which sublimations protect us, the superego is itself the mask screening the real. The humorous superego is the cruel and insatiable agency which bombards me with impossible demands and which mocks my failed attempts to meet them, the agency in the eyes of which I am all the more guilty, the more I try to suppress my sinful strivings and meet its demands. As I have noted, the cynical Stalinist motto about the accused at the show trials who profess their innocence, the more they are innocent, the more they deserve to be shot, is the superego at its purest. Consequently, for Lacan, the superego has nothing to do with moral conscience as far as its most obligatory demands are concerned. The superego is, on the contrary, the anti-ethical agency, the stigmatization of our ethical betrayal. As such, the superego is, at its most elementary, not a prohibitive but a productive agency. Nothing forces anyone to enjoy except the superego. The superego is the imperative of jouissance, enjoy. Although jouissance can be translated as enjoyment, translators of Lacan often leave it in French in order to render palpable its excessive, properly traumatic character. We are not dealing with simple pleasures, but with a violent intrusion that brings more pain than pleasure. No wonder, then, that Lacan posited an equation between jouissance and the superego. To enjoy is not a matter of following one's spontaneous tendencies, it is rather something we do as a kind of weird and twisted ethical duty. When, following Badiou, Critchley defines the subject as something that emerges through fidelity to the good, a subject is the name for the way in which a self binds itself to some conception of the good and shapes its subjectivity in relation to that good. From a strict Lacanian perspective, he is confusing subject and subjectivization. Lacan is here to be opposed to the discourse theory doxa about the subject as an effect of the process of subjectivization. For Lacan, the subject precedes subjectivization. Subjectivization, the constitution of the subject's inner life of experience, is a defense against the subject. As such, the subject is a precondition of the process of subjectivization, in the same sense in which, back in the 1960s, Herbert Marcuse claimed that freedom is the condition of liberation. Insofar as, in a way, the subject, in its content, is nothing positively but the result of the process of subjectivization, one can also say that the subject precedes itself. In order to become subject, it already has to be subject, so that, in its process of becoming, it becomes what it already is. And, incidentally, this feature distinguishes the properly Hegelian dialectical process from pseudo-Hegelian dialectical evolution. The obvious counter-argument to this is that we are dealing here with the archetypal case of ideological illusion. There is no subject prior to the process of subjectivization. Its pre-existence is precisely the inversion that bears witness to the success of the ideological constitution of the subject. Once constituted, the subject necessarily experiences itself as the cause of the very process that constitutes it. That is, it perceives this process as its expression. This, precisely, is the reasoning one should reject. But why exactly? Let us return for a brief moment to Althusser. In Althusserian terms, the subject is constituted through its assumption of an ideological call, through recognizing itself in ideological interpellation. This recognition subjectivizes the pre-ideological individual. Of course, as is clear to Critchley, this interpellation, the assumption of the call of the good, ultimately always fails. The subject cannot ever act at the level of this call. Its endeavors always fall short. It is here that, from the Lacanian perspective, one should supplement the Althusserian account. The subject, in a way, is the failure of subjectivization, the failure of assuming the symbolic mandate, of fully identifying with the ethical call. To paraphrase Althusser's celebrated formula, an individual is interpolated into subjecthood. This interpolation fails, and the subject is this failure. This is why the subject is irreducibly divided between its task and the failure to remain faithful to it. It is in this sense that, for Lacan, the subject is as such hysterical. Hysteria is, at its most elementary, the failure of interpolation, the gnawing worm questioning the identity imposed on the subject by interpolation. Why am I that name? Why am I what the big other claims I am? When Critchley emphasizes how the subject always fails with regard to the call of the ethical thing, he seems to fully endorse this dimension, this failure as constitutive of subjectivity. There is, however, a crucial accent to be added here. It is totally wrong to directly identify this failure of interpolation, the fact that the subject never rises to the level of its responsibility towards the call of the good, with the subject. What accounts for this failure is not simply the limitation of the subject's finitude, its inadequacy to the infinitely demanding task. That is, we are not dealing with the simple gap between the subject's infinite ethical task and its finite reality, which makes it forever inadequate to this task. The subject before subjectivization is a positive force in itself, the infinite force of negativity, called by Freud the death drive, which is why, from the Lacanian perspective, it is problematic to claim that we humans seem to have enormous difficulty in accepting our limitedness, our finiteness, and this failure is a cause of much tragedy. On the contrary, we humans have enormous difficulty in accepting the infinity, undeadness, excess of life, in the very core of our being, the strange immortality whose Freudian name is the death drive. The ethical call does not intervene directly upon the human animal, disturbing its balance with its infinitely demanding injunction. The ethical call, on the contrary, already presupposes that the balance of animal reproduction is thrown off the rails, becomes out of joint, through the transformation of the animal instinct into the death drive. Consequently, ethics is, for Lacan, not directly the zero level of the encounter with the real thing. It is, rather, already a screen which protects us from the destructive impact of the real. It is here that Critchley falsifies in a strange way Lacan's notions of the good and the beautiful from the ethics of psychoanalysis, in that he posits the beautiful as the screen that protects us from the direct exposure to the real thing, whereas for Lacan, the good occupies precisely the same structural place. That is, it is not the real thing itself, but a screen protecting us from its blinding impact. For Critchley, the traumatic intrusion of the radically heterogeneous real thing, which decenters the subject, is identical with the ethical call of the good, while, for Lacan, the radically heterogeneous thing, whose traumatic impact decenters the subject, is, on the contrary, the primordial evil thing, something that cannot ever be sublated, aufgehoben, into a version of the good, something which forever remains a disturbing cut. This is where Critchley's reference to Sade falls short. He claims that the Sadean project still fits the coordinates of the commitment to the good. Sade simply puts what we perceive as to its content as evil at the place of the good. In other words, for Sade, the unbridled use of others as a means of sexual enjoyment is his good, to which he is totally committed. Or, to quote Satan from Milton's Paradise Lost, "Evil, be thou my good." One should rather invert this notion that evil is a content whose very form, the unconditional ethical commitment, remains that of the good. The difference between good and evil is not that of content, but that of form. But again, not in the sense that good is the form of unconditional commitment to a cause, and evil the betrayal of this commitment. It is, on the contrary, the very unconditional fanatical commitment to a cause which is the death drive at its purest and, as such, the primordial form of evil. It introduces into the flow of social life a violent cut that throws it out of joint. The good comes afterwards. It is an attempt to gentrify, to domesticate the traumatic impact of the evil thing. In short, the good is the screened, domesticated evil. Was Kant himself not on the tracks of this paradox in the deadlock of his notions of radical and diabolical evil? Rousseau had already noted that egoism, or the concern for one's well-being, is not opposed to the common good, since altruistic norms can easily be deduced from egotistic concerns. Individualism versus communitarianism, utilitarianism versus the assertion of universal norms, are false oppositions, since the two opposed options amount to the same in their result. The critics who complain how, in today's hedonistic, egotistic society, true values are lacking totally miss the point. The true opposite of egotistic self-love is not altruism, a concern for the common good, but envy, ressentiment, which makes me act against my own interests. The conservative or communitarian critics complain that the ethics one can generate from utilitarian individualist premises can only be a pact between wolves, who conclude it is in the best interest of each of them to constrain their aggressivity rather than genuine solidarity and altruism. But they miss the ironic point. What utilitarian ethics cannot properly account for is not the true good, but evil itself, which is ultimately against my long-term interests.